Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
And welcome, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo, the Apologetic Zone, where we explain how to share, defend, and basically help people to embrace Jesus in this fullness in the Catholic Church. And it's great to be with you today. Got an awesome program in store for you today. Seventh-day Adventism. That's a group that I think many of us are familiar. We have friends, perhaps even relatives who are Seventh-day Adventists. And but it's an unusual group. It's an unusual group. And so to help us kind of explore the different issues involved with Adventism, what their beliefs are, where they came from, how they formed their beliefs, we're actually going to have two guests today. Arthur and Teresa Beem is going to join us. And they were Seventh-day Adventists who entered into the Catholic Church, and they wrote a couple of great books. And we're going to explore the world of Second-day Adventism. So it's going to be very interesting, very unusual program, and I can't wait to chat with them after the first break. And as always, we're going to have our critical thinking skills and critical thinking skills through the Finding the Fallacy. And today's Finding the Fallacy, by the way, is the ecological fallacy. That's an interesting term. And also we're going to meet one of the early church fathers. And today's a biggie. It's St. Polycarp of Smyrna. So an apostolic father, very important in apologetics, along with Ignatius of Antioch and Clement of Rome. So good stuff in store today. Lots of very interesting information. And as always, you are part of the program. If you want to perhaps have a question, maybe for Arthur and Teresa, you can give us a call after the break at 888-526-2151. That is 888-526-2151. Love to hear from you, as always. Or you can always send your questions to the dojo mailbox at questions@handsonapologetics.com. And got some great emails in the dojo mailbox. I'm just going to have to find a program where we can kind of unpack them. So please keep them coming, folks. It's questions@handsonapologetics.com. They all come to my email, and I answer everyone. And sometimes I even have emails on the air. Not all of them, but sometimes I do. So send them in, folks. Love to hear from you. And it's time for our shout-outs for those watching live stream on social media, YouTube, Facebook. Hello, everybody. Great to see you. Look over here at my, the social media section of the dojo, and where I can see the live chat on YouTube. So it's great to see familiar names. Hey, how's it going? Hi, Elsie. Yes, emojis. Very good, folks. And I'd like to welcome all of you listening on radio and podcast. Great to be with you, and it's great that we can share this time to learn how to explain and defend the faith. Well, why don't we jump to our Finding the Fallacy segment of our program? And today's fallacy is the informal fallacy of the ecological fallacy. Now, the ecological fallacy is a formal fallacy in which the interpretation of statistical data that occurs when inferences about the nature of individuals are deduced from the inferences from groups in which those individuals belong. Okay, now you're probably wondering, what in the world did he just say? Well, that's because, usually with logical fallacies, the definition is not as clear as the examples. Basically, it's this. Sometimes when you look at statistical data, you can come up with ideas about groups. Let's say, I'm just pulling this out of the blue, but let's say that males do 2% better on math tests than females, okay? And that's fine. Now, the fallacy comes in when you try to apply that general statistic to an individual case. For example, so let's say Gary is a male, therefore he must do 2% better on math tests than females, or than Jane, who's a female. That is basically where the fallacy comes in. You can't really do that because eventually, I mean, what's true in the norm is not true for every single individual within that norm. Hopefully that makes sense. This is one of those fallacies where it's a little bit of a mind twister. Unless you're into statistics and things like that, then it's probably you're doing an eye roll as you're listening to this. But nevertheless, that is our fallacy for today. So I guess you could say this. Let me give you another concrete example. Let's say 30% of Catholics believe in, or no, 50% of Catholics believe in the real presence. Billy is a Catholic, therefore, he is part of that 50% or something like that. Maybe that's a bad example. Maybe I should have just left it at the definition. Okay. Without further ado, let's move to the Meet the Early Church Father segment. Maybe I'll do better on that segment. Meet the Early Church Father for today is St. Polycarp of Smyrna, who was born roughly around, actually we don't know when he was born. We know he died at the age of 86 in the year 155 or 156 AD. So he's a very early church father. Polycarp was the bishop of Smyrna, which was a very important early church. He was a hearer of the apostles, St. John. And so he knew the apostles, right? He's part of the apostolic fathers. And also he received a letter from another apostolic father named Ignatius of Antioch. And we talked about him, I believe, last week. Another very important early church father, especially in apologetics. So he was a friend of Ignatius, and he was a disciple of St. John, and like I said, very influential. We have one letter from him, and that is a letter to the Philippians, which he wrote roughly around AD 135. And he also had a disciple named Irenaeus of Lyon, yet another very important early church father. Now, St. Irenaeus of Lyon wrote a work called Against All Heresies, roughly around AD 180. Okay. And actually in this work, he talks a little bit about Polycarp. So I would like to read what he says about Polycarp. And this, is, by the way, is in Book 3, Chapter 3, Section 4 of Against Heresies. Irenaeus writes, Polycarp, however, was instructed not only by the apostles and conversed with many who had seen Christ, but also was appointed bishop of the church in Smyrna by the apostles in Asia. I saw him in my early youth, for he tarried a long time, and when quite old he departed this life in a glorious and most noble martyrdom. He always taught those things which he had learned from the apostles, and which the church had handed down, and which are true. To these things all the churches of Asia bear witness, as do also the successors of Polycarp, even to the present time. So this is present time would be 180 AD. And then it's interesting. He continues later on to share a interesting little anecdote about Polycarp. He said once he was met by Marcion. Now, who's Marcion? Marcion was an arch-heretic in the early church. He was a Gnostic, a dualist. He believed that there were actually two principles that created the world, an evil principle that created the material world, and a good principle that created the spiritual world. He rejected the Old Testament. He only accepted the New. Why? Because the New Testament was written by the good God, not the bad God. So, because the Old Testament is so materialistic. So anyway, St. Polycarp meets Marcion, who said to him, "Do you recognize me?" And Polycarp replied, "I recognize you as the firstborn of Satan." Oh, mic drop. Polycarp did not mince words when it came to heresies in the early church. Now, what about his letter to the Philippians? I said that there is an extant writing from Polycarp. In fact, there are several supposed letters, but actually there's only one extant authentic letter. What is preserved is actually a single letter to the Philippians, which actually contains two letters. Okay, so the letter to the Philippians is actually two letters put together. At least this is according to Jurgen's Faith of the Early Church Fathers. The first letters consist of chapter 13 in the textual tradition, possibly 14, and it dates sometime immediately before Ignatius arrived at Rome, roughly around 110 AD. Okay, so between 110 AD and the end of Trajan's reign in 118. So that those two chapters seem to be a single letter included within this letter. And within the short period, and earlier dates probably preferable to a later one. For the first letter to Polycarp to the Philippians was merely a cover note for the letters that Ignatius wrote, which Polycarp forwarded to the Philippians. In other words, Ignatius of Antioch wrote a letter to the Philippians and through Polycarp. So this couple of chapters apparently is the cover letter that Polycarp included when he sent Ignatius' letter to the Philippians. Now, the second letter consists of chapters 1 through 12 in the textual tradition, and this dates a bit later, around AD 135. I know, a little confusing, but it's interesting because we consider it one letter, but actually scholars believe that actually 1 through 12 was a later letter, and then an addition of the 13 and possibly the 14th chapter was actually a cover letter that he attached to the letters of Ignatius to this very, very early church. Fascinating stuff. That is our early church father for today, Polycarp of Smyrna. Very important one. And like I said, he's buddies with Ignatius, one of my all-time faves as far as the early church fathers. And coming up on the other side of the break, we're going to be talking about Seventh-day Adventism with the Beams. It's going to be a fascinating conversation, everybody. Stay tuned. There is more to come on Hands-On Apologetics. We'll be right back.
This is Terry Barber reminding you there's a women's conference coming up September 7th, 2019 at the Sacred Heart Chapel. Mary Danielle Barber will be speaking along with Barbara Nicolosi. They're going to be talking about true femininity, be who you are. This is going to be for your daughters, your mothers. Every woman should be at this conference. And the way to do it is go to virginmostpowerfulradio.org or call 877-526-2151. Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands on Apologetics. And we're going to talk about a very fascinating Protestant group known as the Seventh-day Adventist, and to help us work through what their beliefs are and how they are different from Catholic beliefs. We have two people who are going to come onto the program who were former Seventh-day Adventists. That is Arthur and Teresa Beem. Arthur and Teresa Beem authored It's Okay Not to Be a Seventh-day Adventist, and The Kingdom, How God Led Us from Protestantism to Catholic Truth. Arthur and Teresa, welcome to Hands on Apologetics. Richard, I can't hear for some reason.
Oh, do we need to speak up?
I got it. Yep.
Got it?
Okay, there you go.
Good afternoon,
Right
Mr. Matsuda.
Yeah, it's great to have you both on the show because, like I said, Seventh-day Adventism, very fascinating group. And now Teresa was on the show probably, I think, a couple of weeks ago, and you shared your journey. And Arthur, from what I understand, you came from a pretty strict Adventist home.
Yeah, I would say Orthodox, definitely. Strongly Orthodox Adventist, yes.
Yeah, very good. So I'm just curious, like, when did Catholicism kind of come onto your radar? Because as Teresa was describing in the last program, that Adventists view Catholicism as probably, the precursor to the Antichrist. That everybody will be forced to worship on Saturday.
Yes.
What was significant for you? To thought, well, there might be something with Catholicism.
Wow, very late actually. We had been, well, like she said, kind of church shopping because we knew nothing about anybody outside the Adventist church, and pretty much we I don't want to say hated Catholicism, but it was a terror. It was a fear. It's built into us from when we're little children to fear Catholicism. So that never even really crossed our minds. But we finally came to the point where we said, Lord, wherever you want us to go, we're going to follow you. And if that's find out information about Catholicism, then we'll do that. And that was tough. You have to understand how the fear of Adventists of Catholicism is pretty great. But
it was well after we left the Adventist
yes,
church
well
that we
after.
Considered. It was probably like 2005.
Yeah.
And we came into the church in 2008.
Right.
Yeah, and that was through the pro-life movement, right?
Yeah, they were definitely the very first group that got us interested in Catholicism. Maybe they weren't the demons.
Right.
We didn't have horns and tails and
yeah,
very good. So it's a very fascinating history about how Adventism started, and maybe if you could give us like a thumbnail sketch of like how did this group come about?
Well, so in the early 1800s, there's a man named William Miller who did some calculations using the biblical books of Daniel and Revelation, and he discovered what he thought was the day Jesus would return, which to him was October 22, 1844. So after that prophecy had failed, there was a small group who wouldn't give up on that date and decided that Miller didn't correctly interpret what was supposed to happen then. Jesus wasn't supposed to come then to earth, but he went in and started what they call the investigative judgment. Okay. So these people, they chose to follow this teaching still. Jesus began this investigative judgment, and it was of the living and the dead. Then the group added to this a special last day gospel, the idea that there was going to be a last and final test for Christians on the day you worshiped. So Adventists believed in the 4th century that the Pope, and along with Emperor Constantine, wickedly changed the 10 Commandments, arbitrarily changed the Sabbath commandment to Sunday, kind of mixing pagan and Christian worship together. Then they started to believe God wants every Christian on the planet to hear the warning of the Seventh-day Adventist Church that if you continue to worship on Sunday instead of keeping the seventh-day Sabbath holy, one day you'll receive the mark of the beast. That's what your eternal soul will be tested on right before the second coming. Let's see, they also believe that the Vatican will issue a worldwide Sunday law that will legally enforce that all humans must worship on the first day of the week, not the seventh. So Seventh-day Adventists will be hunted down and martyred during this time because they alone will be following God and keep the Sabbath. So in a nutshell, that's what you're looking at.
Good. So it was essentially William Miller's failure in 1844 and the great disappointment of that failure that the Adventists kind of stepped in the breach and said, wait, it's not a failure. God is testing us. And ultimately the test would be that you have to worship on the Sabbath. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, who did this? How did they know that God was doing this test? I mean, obviously, it's not in Scripture, right? Or is it in Scripture?
Well, it came about because of Adventists. They followed this guy, and I'm trying to think of it's not Josiah Litch. I can't remember his name at the moment. But there was a guy that had this vision about the investigative judgment, and then from that, this young lady called Ellen G. White, started having visions that backed up what the church, what these visions of this other guy had about the investigative judgment. And then they had this lady come in and preached it in the Sabbath through Uriah, who brought it in through Uriah Smith. And it was through those few people that the Seventh-day Adventist Church was started. And but it was basically these people would get the Bible, they would read the Bible, they would interpret it, and then Ellen White would have visions then to say, well, her accompanying angel supports what they interpreted the Scriptures.
Would back up everything.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's basically, it was, right. So they think everything that they believe is scriptural. But that's because the accompanying angel verified it. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, in fact, you did a great book. It's a great book, but you did a great job in your book. It's okay not to be Seventh-day Adventist because you described some of these visions that she had, where she would be talking or lecturing, and then she would just, fall down on the floor and be catatonic, and then wake up and say, "Hey, an angel told me."
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, actually, it was a little bit like the Barnum and Bailey, or the Barnum, a sucker is born every minute. I mean, literally,
sure.
Her husband, James White. I was going to say Joseph Smith. No. James White put her in front of people hoping that she would go into one of these, what we believe is epilepsy or some type of hemorrhage of the brain. But then he would ask people to come up on stage and put her through tests to see if she was breathing, and then she would come out of it, and it was like a little mini miracle every single time she would speak, and people would, thousands of people would come to listen to her in hopes that one of these visions would come upon her. I felt like when I read this story, it was almost as if he was.
It seemed a little abusive to your own wife.
Right, a little bit odd to be wanting your wife to go into a vision in front of everyone for this purpose,
Yeah.
Yeah, so are these visions considered like genuine revelation, or is this just like what Catholics would say, a private revelation that's meant only for her?
The entire Seventh-day Adventist Church is based on her visions.
Okay.
Now, if you try to pin them down theologically on that, they waffle a little bit. But in practice, that's what ends up in practice it being are these revelations.
I think that they sincerely believe it's biblical, but it's biblical through her interpretation.
Right, through the eyes of Ellen White, yes. Mm-hmm.
Right, so it's confirmed that it's biblical, therefore it's biblical.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So is there a set writings of hers that are considered authoritative, or is everything that she wrote authoritative?
Everything.
Yeah.
She is continually saying, the angel told me.
My accompanying angel told me. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, wow. So, okay, so the revelation is that Christians are going to undergo a test. Now, actually, this is an interesting question. Did they believe that Jesus came back invisibly? Like, for example, the Jehovah's Witnesses and other Adventists, that there was an invisible coming and then there will be a visible one later on?
That was a different Millerite movement.
Okay, different.
That group did break off from the Millerites, but it was a different group. The Seventh-day Adventists rejected that. They do not believe there was a spiritual second coming. They believe that Jesus moved from the Holy of Holies to the Most Holy. In other words, he moved compartments in the heavenly sanctuary, and he began the investigative judgment. And so that's what they believe happened on October 22.
Okay, yeah, that's fascinating. Go ahead, Arthur.
That's what makes it so difficult theologically when people approach Seventh-day Adventists. Seventh-day Adventists will insist they are dealing on the same plane as other theologians, as a Baptist, evangelical, Catholic, whoever, and they're not. They claim that they are biblically based, which is to a degree is true, but it's always through the eyes of Ellen White. But they don't tell you that. It makes it difficult in conversation with them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what I've noticed whenever I dialogue with an SDA member is that it always goes around in a circle. You know, you never actually pin them down on anything because it moves from one thing to another, then back to the first thing.
And they're constantly protecting that Sabbath doctrine.
Yes.
So no matter where you move or try to have a conversation with them, they're constantly always guarding that Sabbath doctrine because they will not capitulate on that one thing. It's their whole persona.
Yeah, they're willing to martyr themselves over it. In other words, that's what they're preparing for, is martyrdom for the Sabbath, because that is the last day test.
Right.
Interesting. So the seventh day, worshiping on the seventh day, is a salvation issue. It's kind of like the sine qua non of everything else. Because.
But I think they would say that for today. It's only in the last days, once the Sunday law, once the Catholic Church brings in the Sunday law, and you're given a choice, because the whole world is going to have to be given a choice. Right. And right now, good people, Ellen White said, good people are keeping Sunday, thinking that they're on the worshiping on the correct day.
Right.
But once that Sunday law is passed, that's going to be the testing moment. That's
the big throwdown.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Very good. Well, we're talking with Arthur and Teresa Beem about Seventh-day Adventism. More on the other side of the break, folks. Stay tuned.
This is Terry Barber reminding you there's a women's conference coming up September 7th, 2019 at the Sacred Heart Chapel. Mary Danielle Barber will be speaking along with Barbara Nicolosi. They're going to be talking about true femininity, be who you are. This is going to be for your daughters, your mothers. Every woman should be at this conference. And the way to do it is go to virginmostpowerfulradio.org or call 877-526-2151. Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We're talking Seventh-day Adventism with converts Arthur and Teresa Beem. They're both authors of It's Okay Not to Be Seventh-day Adventist, and also The Kingdom, How God Led Us from Protestantism into Catholic Truth. And let's talk, we could probably have several segments on Sabbath worship and all that, but where exactly do they go to propound Sabbath worship? And is there any problems with how they reason for Sabbath worship?
That's a huge one.
Well,
I know.
Say they go to the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to admit, that's a pretty interesting trap that they can set up for any Protestants that go to church on and who believe that the Sunday is the Christian Sabbath.
Right.
They'll go, okay, where in the New Testament does it say that? You prove that to us through Scripture, and that's their hook.
Yeah, they have a very convoluted view of the New Covenant. And the last one I heard, one of their big theologians, he brought in the New Covenant, but he whipped it he whipped it back around into the old covenant of the old Jewish covenant of the desert, Huh. And it was actually, I was kind of amazed. How in the world did you do that? It's not correct, but if somebody doesn't put forth some effort and read and study, you might think what he was saying was accurate.
Yeah. In fact, I got an email from a person who read your book, and they asked me that you mentioned that the Jews didn't worship on the Sabbath. They kept the Sabbath holy. They were what was worship was sacrifices in the temple. So it's not really correspondent to Christianity per se. Any comments on that, or?
Well, okay, so let me ask you. You're a Catholic apologist. If I, as a Seventh-day Adventist, were to come to you and say, okay, why don't you keep the Sabbath? What would your response be?
Well, I would go to why did God choose the Sabbath? And, I would have a whole spiel. Let's put it that way. I don't know if I want to go through it. It's the Sabbath rest, but it also commemorates the Exodus. And so when Christ comes, he inaugurates a new creation with a new Sabbath rest, and he is the new Moses that has a new Exodus. So It's changed to the day of resurrection.
You've thought about it, though. See,
I know.
Most just look at it and are completely dumbfounded. Yeah. It is not a subject that most Christians consider.
Absolutely.
How did the Jewish Sabbath become the Christian Sunday?
Right.
So, anyway.
Turns in kind of to a gotcha moment for an Adventist who is pushing that.
Right.
Yeah, and also you could point to the Lord's Day, that they broke the bread on the Lord's Day, and also the early church fathers. Now, let me ask you this. Whenever I go to the early church fathers and say, see, the earliest Christians worshipped on Sunday, then that becomes, well, that's Catholic tradition. Then how do you know it's Catholic tradition's wrong? It's because they violate the Sabbath.
Right.
Okay, but this is where, if you want to talk to Seventh-day Adventist, this is what you need to bring up.
Okay.
Christians don't necessarily have a day of worship. They have a holy day of obligation, which is Sunday, but that is for the resurrection. That's how we commemorate the resurrection. We actually worship every single day. There is no, as a matter of fact, the Jews did not have Sabbath as a day of worship, like you just said. And this is where you need to explain to Adventists, there is no such thing, nor has there ever been such a thing as a proper day to worship. You worshiped Christ every single day. And the early church went to the temple daily, and they broke bread daily. They had their Eucharist. Today, Catholics have a daily corporate worship. And that is where you have to explain. They don't understand that. See, the Adventism grew up in America, which has the Protestants only have, one day they go to church. And so this is where this all gets convoluted, is that they conflate the Protestant Christian day of worship the Protestant Sabbath, which they consider Sunday to be their Christian Sabbath, where that's not technically true for Catholics. But, and so that is what, and you've got to first hit the Adventists with Catholics worship daily. There is no such thing in a Catholic worldview of a correct day of worship. Right. Would that be correct?
Yeah.
I just want to
absolutely.
Okay. That first of all just ruins it. They did not know that. All you have to do is get online and check out mass schedules at different churches, and you'll find out they worship daily.
Yeah, they try to inflict the we don't keep the Sabbath holy. And what we've started doing is that we go to Mass on Saturday. Now what?
Right.
And they don't know what to do with that yet. They haven't come up with a good answer for that yet.
Right.
That's a really interesting question.
Is it right to go to church and Mass on Sunday? Forget about the Sabbath part. Is it okay to worship on Sunday as well? They don't know how to answer that one either.
Well, it's because the last message of God to the world is you will have the mark of the beast if you go to church on Sunday. And so they have never had anybody hit them with that. Okay, prove from Scripture that it is wrong to go to church on Sunday. Do you see what I'm saying? They conflate. Yeah. If you automatically think of Sunday as a Sabbath, then you will conflate the idea that that you have usurped the old covenant, right. and that's not a good way of saying it. But anyway, you've got to show them there's never a wrong day to worship Christ on.
That's really well put. I know. I feel like this is a master's level course. I love it. This is great. So what other distinctives would the average Catholic not know about Seventh-day Adventism? We talked a little bit about Ellen Gould White, and she has prophetess.
I can tell you one of the big ones right off the bat is fear.
Yeah.
When we were growing up, there's so many things that are given to you subtly. They're not a doctrine per se. They aren't written in a book per se, so they can never be pinned down with it. But it's this indoctrination of fear towards anybody that's not a Seventh-day Adventist. And so when you address a Seventh-day Adventist, understand most of them are scared of you. You know, there's especially if you have a tab collar on, you're really scared of them. I mean, they pretty much, they're demonic, and they really literally do think that. Now, the new Adventists, I would say, in the past 20 years, have hidden that better, and so it's more subtle. They may not admit that they're fearful, you know, and they're trying to be more mainstream because for a long time they were kind of looked at like, I don't know, Scientologists or Jehovah's Witness, or, you know, really out there, and they're trying to be more mainstream. But all of this is still there. If you have Ellen White, then you have this fear. It's just part of it. And that's a huge one right there, is Catholics need to be very understanding of what's going on in their worship of the seventh day. And they would argue that to the death, but it's the worship of the seventh day, and their fear is pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, that's a really good tip, because you can imagine with that worldview that the final test is going to be that the papacy is going to force you to do Sunday worship. You know, of course, in the back of your mind, you're always going to have that fear when especially with talking to Catholics, that, you know, they're just luring you in.
Right.
so that you'll trip up when
And
Jesus
it's like
comes.
they think all of us are trying to do that, not just the Pope or a bishop or a cardinal, or no, all of us are trying to distract them and tantalize them away from the seventh day. Anything we can do, it's like.
Another thing I want to,
Sure.
this is not just a plug, but we're going to start in August a podcast for Adventists explaining Catholic doctrine, because there is incredible misunderstanding. And so we're going to do a series, and we'll put it online, but going through each of the Catholic, we're not going to really attack Adventists. What we're going to do is we're going to take Catholic doctrines and explain them, because they have such a different worldview than Catholics.
And vocabulary.
They use the same vocabulary,
Yes.
but they mean something different. That we need to, because this is really sad. The Bible says that they'll know that we are Christians by our love one for another. And Jesus even said that they're going to know that He is the Christ because of our unity. And so they need to let go of this fear that they have of Catholics, so that they can join with us in Christian love.
And unity.
Right. And so that they can join us, because they don't even join the pro-life movement because they are so afraid of Catholicism.
Yeah.
And, they're the stragglers, and the group, the herd of
That's a lot of that fear.
Yeah, and the herd of Christianity, they're the weak ones at the end that are going to be grabbed by
Can
the
be
devil.
deceived. Deception is a big deal to them.
So we need to show them the true Catholicism, because I think that they would make fantastic Catholics.
Oh, they would. They would be great.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, all the Seventh-day Adventists I know are fine people, godly people.
Yes.
But it's so hard to dialogue, and that fear explains a lot. And
Right.
so, I definitely encourage you, and to the listeners, when you get the podcast up, let us know. We'll give a shout out here at the dojo, and maybe you can come on every now and then. You can tell us what you're talking about on the podcast.
Would love to. Love it.
Sure.
Love your show.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we're talking with Arthur and Teresa Beem about Seventh-day Adventism here on Hands on Apologetics. And stay tuned, folks. More to come after the break.
This is Terry Barber reminding you there's a women's conference coming up September 7th, 2019 at the Sacred Heart Chapel. Mary Danielle Barber will be speaking along with Barbara Nicolosi. They're going to be talking about true femininity. Be who you are. This is going to be for your daughters, your mothers. Every woman should be at this conference. And the way to do it is go to virginmostpowerfulradio.org or call 877-526-2151. Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands on Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands on Apologetics. We are chatting with converts, Arthur and Teresa Beem, about Seventh-day Adventism. And Teresa, you already anticipated my follow-up question, which is really the ultimate question. Is how can a Catholic communicate to a Seventh-day Adventist if there's this fear, if there's this doctrine about the end times and the church imposing Sunday worship and stuff? How do you get through that?
Do you care if I answer this?
Oh, please do.
Okay.
Go right ahead.
Okay. I have listened to tons of debates between Catholics and Protestants, and it all comes down to authority. Absolutely, it comes down to authority, and that's where you need to start all the debates. But with the Seventh-day Adventist, it's not going to work because until you can take away the authority of Ellen White, you have to take away her authority, and the only way that you can do that is that you show that Catholics do not have a day of worship. That's so important because it is assumed. I mean, a lot of Catholics believe, hey, because we have a holy day of obligation, that we have a specific day of worship, and that is not true. Throughout history, Christians and Jews themselves worshipped daily. There is no such thing as a day of worship. And let me see what's.
That's the biggie. I have a couple others. Is that Adventists have a couple big hooks. One of their big hooks is they have Daniel Revelation seminars, and you'll see their big billboards up, around towns periodically of all the beasts of Revelation and all of that. And that's where the first original fear factor starts, is on those Daniel and Revelation seminars. Okay. Secondly, what Ellen White did with Kellogg, and you just have to kind of look into the history of that. She was buddies with Kellogg, the cereal guy, about their whole lifestyle as far as being vegetarian, no caffeine, no meat, things like that. Now, a lot of that has lightened up in the last 20 years with this subtler Adventist group.
They're not as legalistic.
They're not as legalistic, but that's still there. They try to deny it, but it's still there because they still go by Ellen White. But those two were big, huge hooks for them. So they have their hospitals that are Seventh-day Adventist-based hospitals. Unfortunately, so those are a couple big hooks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People just need to realize that when you speak to Seventh-day Adventists, be very strong in the fact that we are New Covenant Christians. Right. That they believe that the Sabbath from Friday night sundown till Saturday night sundown is still needed, is still valid, and you have to go, no. Actually, when Jesus said, "I come to me and I will give you rest," in a sense, he was fulfilling that Sabbath obligation because in the end, that's what the Sabbath was for the Jews. It was a rest that they were supposed to have in God and his completed work in him from Genesis, but as well in his completed work in getting them out of their slavery in Egypt. And that was to remind them on a weekly rhythmic basis that they were to rest in God. And when Christ said, "Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest," he was fulfilling the meaning of the Sabbath. And even though we still have a weekly rest on Sunday, it is actually, if you read Pope John Paul II's and I don't know how to say this correctly, but the Dies Domini, is that how you say it?
Day Domini? Yeah.
Yeah. He actually says that our Sunday commemoration is more akin to the yearly Passover Sabbath than the weekly Sabbath, even though there's similarities. He says it is more directly akin and a fulfillment of the Passover. And most people don't realize that. Most American Catholics just really don't understand the depth of the symbolism of the Sabbath. It is very profound, and I did go through a little bit of that in the book. It's okay not to be Seventh Adventist.
Right.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. Another question I have, and I wasn't really clear on it, is I think it's the three angel message.
Oh, yeah.
Did I get that correct? What is that?
Three angels message. Mm-hmm.
That's the new gospel. That's what they believe, that God in 1844, or what actually was a little bit after that, after the Great Disappointment of 1844, when the Adventist Church began, their job was as a special and sole remnant of Christ to deliver this last day message. It is the new and updated gospel. And that's the whole thing about the Sabbath. You've got to...
it's one of their logos, is the angels,
Right. And,
right.
and
okay. Yeah, I didn't put two and two together on that one.
It's called the three angels message is equivalent to saying the everlasting gospel for Adventists, and the everlasting gospel is the one about the Sabbath, because the Sabbath itself is everlasting. They believe that throughout all eternity, the Ten Commandments will stand for everyone. That's going to be the moral, everlasting law. And because of that, the Sabbath will always be there.
Even in heaven, we'll have Sabbath. Yeah. Saturday.
Oh, wow. Yeah. One more question for you, and it could be just I haven't looked in the right places. But this isn't my library. This is like a little offshoot of my library. But nevertheless, behind me is, on the bottom shelf, is works of Ellen Gould White. But it's hard to find a catechism, if you will, of all the teachings. Like the only one I could find is a Seventh-day Adventists believe, and they get 27 biblical explanations. Yeah, is there a catechism or some explanation of
it? It would be the 28 fundamental beliefs. That's what you're looking for. That's it.
Okay. Yeah, this says 27, so maybe I have to get a new edition.
I think there's 28 now, but I don't know that they put out a new one. I think that
that would be their catechism, if you will.
Okay. Yeah, because it's really hard to find. At least I couldn't find any compendium of beliefs that this is what we believe and why. I know Protestants often accuse Seventh-day Adventists of works righteousness, that resting on the Sabbath is like earning your salvation, which really isn't fair, is it?
They don't see it that way. They see it as just like Catholics believe. It is very equivalent to the fact that Catholics believe that we will be moral as a result of our love for Christ. They believe that if you love Christ, you will keep the Sabbath. So they don't see it. They see it as a fruit of Christianity.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. The other question too is, and this fits perfectly with your story, and I wonder if you would suggest this for Catholic moral issues. Is that a possible bridge? Our pro-life stand, artificial contraception, that type of stuff. Could that be a door that people could build bridges, or at least get them thinking about like non-Sabbath worshiping topics?
I don't know.
Yeah, I see you biting your lip, so that's maybe not, huh?
I think that they would just automatically dismiss that because they're pro-choice, and they believe that they're pro-choice based on the fact that that's conscience. That's a matter of our personal conscience, and so they would see all of those. So I don't know that would be the bridge. What would be the bridge?
Yeah, that would be a tough one, because that leads back to the Seventh Day thing. When you philosophically follow that track, you end up back at the seventh day. They stay away from anything that's conscience, really.
And if it isn't in the Ten Commandments.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah. So that would be tough. They would say, yeah, they could agree with you morally, but in practice, they're pro-choice. The way their things read, they leave a big, huge, open hole to get through for. Well, it comes down to your personal choice as a woman, between you and your doctor.
Honestly, I the first thing I would say to them is, I keep the Sabbath in Christ.
That's the biggest. It's really more.
I would not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would continually confront the Sabbath issue and say, we worship daily. We keep the Sabbath in Christ. Christ is the end of the Sabbath. We're New Covenant Christians. That would be the
talking about getting your vocabulary down, that's really what you're left with them,
right.
Is that.
Because until you get past the Sabbath issue, they're not going to listen to anything else.
Yeah, everything else is just noise to them when it comes down to Saturday.
Yeah, very good. Well, for Catholic apologists, that podcast that you're going to do is very important because it's so important to understand jargon, terminology, how people look at things and phrase things. Yes. So when did you say you're going to start it?
We're going to try to start in August. Arthur works full time, so trying to do a podcast on a regular basis is hard, but we're going to try to get them out, at least a couple a month.
Wow, that's exciting. That's great. So, boy, I can't believe the hour has flown. I feel like I said, I got a master's degree today. Such great information. How can people get a hold of your stuff? Do you have a blog or?
We have Sunbeam. What is it? Sunbeamproductions.com?
Yes, SONBEEM Productions.com. And very then, of good. Course, we have books on Amazon, which is, It's okay. And you understand why we have the name of the book, It's Okay Not to Be Seventh-day Adventist, because that's not a statement that they can make. And so we did it specifically for them. And then, of course, her series, Mission Vatican, is on Amazon also, which is excellent. It also gets into a lot of Protestant, Catholic, it's very good series. Excellent.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on Hands On Apologetics. We appreciate it.
Yes, it's been wonderful. Thank you for the invitation.
Very, very much for inviting us.
All right. God bless. And that is... and that is Arthur and Teresa Beem, ladies and gentlemen, Seventh-day Adventism. Very interesting group. And like we mentioned in the podcast, Seventh-day Adventists are such great people. Just good, solid Christians. And it's really, we should be reaching out to them in any way we can. Coming up tomorrow, we have Anthony Digman coming into the dojo. He's going to discuss the first part of his catechesis, which is faith and science. And coming up next, High Intensity Catholic Talk Radio, coming at you with the Terry and Jesse Show, dynamic duo of Virgin Most Powerful Productions. It's time for me to shut down the Midwest Command Center here and turn off the dojo lights. I want to thank everybody for listening in. And as always, I wish everybody a happy, holy day. And God willing, we'll talk again tomorrow. Bye-bye, everybody.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church. So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.